There is a particular kind of silence that unsettles people far more than shouting ever could. It is the silence of a man who used to explain himself, who used to justify, apologize, clarify, soften, and translate his every decision into something palatable for others, and then, one day, simply stopped. No announcement. No confrontation. No dramatic exit. He just stopped. And the people around him, the ones who had grown comfortable with his constant need for their approval, felt something shift beneath their feet, though none of them could name it at first. You have to understand what explaining yourself actually costs a person. Every time you justify a decision that requires no justification, you are quietly signing a contract that says your right to exist as you are is subject to someone else's approval. You are handing over a piece of your sovereignty, wrapped neatly in the language of politeness. Most people do this thousands of times across a single year and never notice the toll. Because each individual explanation feels small, feels reasonable, feels like simple courtesy. But sovereignty is not lost in one catastrophic moment. It is lost in 1,000 tiny surrenders, each one so minor it barely registers, until one day a person looks in the mirror and does not recognize the version of themselves staring back. The man in question, we will call him nothing, because he could be anyone. And that is the point. Spent years functioning this way. He explained his silence when he was tired. He explained his boundaries when they inconvenienced others. He explained his ambitions to people who had no genuine investment in his growth, only in his predictability. And predictability, it turns out, is what most relationships are quietly built on. Not love. Not loyalty. Predictability. People do not actually need you to be happy. They need you to be knowable, controllable, and available on demand. The moment you stop being those three things, the relationship reveals its true architecture. And often that architecture is far more transactional than anyone wants to admit. So, what changed? It was not a single event, though there is always a moment that becomes the symbolic turning point in hindsight. It was an accumulation of small betrayals, disguised as normal social friction. The friend who only called when something was needed. The family member who treated boundaries as personal attacks. The colleague who mistook kindness for a lack of ambition. Each of these moments, on their own, seemed forgivable. But taken together, they painted a picture. And the picture was this: the more he explained, the less he was respected. The more he justified, the more permission he unconsciously granted others to question him further. This is the part that most people never learn, and it is worth saying clearly, so say it now in the comments if you feel this truth settling into your chest. My silence is not your invitation to interrogate me. Write it. Let it become real by naming it. Because the moment you understand this principle, you begin to see explanation itself differently, not as kindness, but as a subtle form of self-erasure. He began to notice something curious once he stopped. The people who respected him did not need explanations. They trusted his decisions because they trusted him. And trust does not require a paper trail of justification. But the people who had built their comfort around his constant self-disclosure, they reacted with confusion first, then irritation, then something closer to hostility. Because when you stop explaining yourself to people who are used to controlling you through your explanations, you are not just changing your behavior. You are removing their leverage. And people do not surrender leverage gracefully, even when they never consciously realized they had it. This is where the psychology becomes genuinely fascinating, almost architectural in its precision. Manipulation, in its most common and unglamorous form, does not look like a villain twirling a mustache. It looks like guilt disguised as concern. It looks like a question asked not out of curiosity, but out of a need to reassert control. Where were you? Why didn't you answer? Why are you being like this? Each question is a small test, probing to see whether the old version of you, the explaining version, the apologizing version, still exists beneath the surface. And here is the truth that separates those who reclaim their sovereignty from those who remain trapped in explaining forever. The moment you answer that question with justification, instead of calm, unbothered silence, you confirm to them that the old you is still available for use. He learned to let questions hang in the air, unanswered, not out of cruelty, but out of a refined understanding that not every question deserves the dignity of a response. Silence, used correctly, is not the absence of communication. It is the most advanced form of communication that exists, because it communicates the one thing that words cannot, that you no longer need their approval to feel complete. This is a difficult truth to sit with, because most of us were raised to believe that silence is rude, that engagement is respect, that withholding a response is somehow a small act of violence. But there is a profound difference between silence born of coldness and silence born of sovereignty. One punishes, the other simply protects. If this distinction is resonating with you right now, let it settle, and if it does, type it plainly where others can see. I owe no one an explanation for my peace. Because writing it is how the mind begins to believe it. What happened next in his life is what happens to almost everyone who makes this shift, and it is worth preparing for, because it is rarely comfortable. The people who benefited most from his constant explanations began to test him harder. They escalated. They accused him of becoming cold, distant, arrogant, changed. And here lies one of the darkest and most important truths in this entire philosophy. When a manipulator loses access to your explanations, they will often recast your boundaries as betrayal. They will tell you that the version of you who stopped over-explaining is somehow less kind than the version who exhausted himself, proving his worth daily. Do not believe them. Their discomfort is not evidence of your wrongdoing. It is evidence that the old dynamic, the one that served them, is dying. And they are grieving their loss of control, not your loss of character. This is the moment where most people falter and retreat back into old patterns, because the social pressure to explain, to soften, to apologize for having boundaries at all, is immense. But the ones who endure this pressure without collapsing back into their old habits are the ones who emerge permanently changed. They stop needing external validation to know they made the right decision. They begin to trust their own internal compass more than the opinions of people who only valued their compliance. There is a particular kind of power that comes from this. And it is not loud power. It does not announce itself. It does not perform dominance. It simply exists, quietly, in the way a person carries themselves once they no longer feel the compulsive need to be understood by everyone in the room. Ruthless self-mastery, real self-mastery, is not about becoming cold to the world. It's about becoming so secure in your own reasoning that other people's confusion about your choices is no longer your emergency to solve. He noticed, months into this transformation, that his relationships had quietly reorganized themselves. The people who could not tolerate his silence drifted away, sometimes with resentment, sometimes with a parting insult designed to provoke one final explanation from him. He gave none. And the people who remained fewer in number, but far more genuine in nature, related to him differently. They asked less, assumed more good faith, and respected the boundaries he set without demanding justification for each one. This is the quiet, often invisible reward of sovereignty. It does not shrink your world. It refines it. If you have ever felt exhausted from constantly proving your intentions to people who were never going to believe you regardless of what you said, this is your signal. And if it is, let the comments section hold your declaration. I am done auditioning for people's approval. There is one more layer to this, darker and more precise than the rest. And it deserves to be said plainly. Explaining yourself excessively does not just cost you social standing. It slowly convinces your own subconscious that your instincts are unreliable, that your decisions require external validation to be considered legitimate. Over years, this erodes something far more valuable than any single relationship. It erodes your relationship with yourself. The moment he stopped explaining to others, he began, almost accidentally, to stop over-explaining to himself as well. Decisions that once triggered internal spirals of self-doubt began to feel simply like decisions. Made, final. Not up for debate, not even in his own head. This is the deepest form of the sovereign mindset, not merely withholding explanations from others, but withdrawing the internal habit of justifying your existence to yourself. Because the moment you no longer need to convince yourself that your boundaries are valid, your ambitions are reasonable, your silence is acceptable, you have crossed into a form of psychological independence that very few people ever reach. Most spend their entire lives performing explanations for an audience, external or internal, that was never going to grant them peace regardless of how convincing the argument was. The man who stopped explaining himself did not become cruel. He did not become distant for the sake of distance. He simply stopped renting out his peace to people who had never paid for it honestly. And in that quiet, undramatic shift, he discovered something that all the explanations in the world had never given him: the profound, settled feeling of being entirely, immovably his own. If something in this has reached you, do not let it pass quietly. Write it down where it can be seen. My silence is my sovereignty, and I no longer explain what does not require defending.